The summer heat of Tehran in July 1943 hung like a physical weight over the city, shimmering in waves that distorted the distant Alborz mountains into liquid mirages. In a nondescript building near the British Embassy compound, Hauptmann Friedrich Dietrich of the Abwehr sat motionless at his desk, studying reconnaissance photographs with the intensity of a man decoding his own death warrant. The images before him showed something that should have been impossible: a procession of American-made trucks stretching across the Iranian plateau in numbers that defied every logistical calculation he had made over the previous 18 months. The photographs had arrived via diplomatic pouch from Istanbul that morning, carried by an agent who had risked everything to photograph what Allied security had tried desperately to hide. Dietrich lit a cigarette with hands that remained perfectly steady despite the implications of what he was seeing, and began to write his report with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through 4 years of intelligence work in the most dangerous corners of the war. The Persian Corridor, as the Allies called it with bureaucratic detachment, had become the third lifeline feeding the Soviet war machine, alongside the Arctic convoys to Murmansk and the Pacific route through Vladivostok. When Germany had invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Dietrich had been among the intelligence officers who calculated that the Soviets would collapse within 6 months, starved of the industrial capacity to replace their catastrophic losses. Those calculations had failed to account for American industrial might and British imperial infrastructure, combined with Stalin's ruthless determination to keep fighting regardless of cost. By the summer of 1942, the first American trucks had begun arriving at Iranian ports, part of Roosevelt's Lend-Lease commitment to provide the Soviets with the materials they needed to survive. The British and Soviets had jointly occupied Iran in August 1941, removing the Shah and installing his more compliant son, transforming the ancient Persian kingdom into a giant supply depot. Now, 2 years later, Dietrich was watching the full scale of that transformation in photographs that showed truck convoys moving day and night through mountain passes and across desert roads that had barely existed before the occupation. The intelligence problem was maddeningly complex because the operation itself was a marvel of improvisation and engineering. The trucks visible in Dietrich's photographs were Studebakers, Dodges, and Chevrolets, manufactured in Detroit and shipped across the Atlantic to Iranian ports at Khorramshahr and Bandar Shapur on the Persian Gulf. American engineers had arrived in Iran in 1942 to rebuild the Trans-Iranian Railway, a single-track line that ran nearly 900 miles from the Gulf ports north to Tehran and beyond to the Soviet border. British railway experts, many pulled from service in India, had joined them, bringing with them the colonial experience of moving supplies across impossible terrain. Together, they had transformed a railway that could barely handle 200 tons per day into a conveyor belt carrying thousands of tons of war material northward every 24 hours. The trucks that couldn't fit on the trains drove themselves north on roads that American Army engineers were building and improving as the convoys rolled, creating infrastructure as they went in a race against the Wehrmacht's ability to break Soviet resistance on the Eastern Front. Dietrich's photographs showed something more disturbing than mere logistical competence. They showed an operation that had achieved a tempo and scale that suggested the Allies had solved problems German planners had considered insurmountable. The heat in southern Iran during summer reached levels that could kill men and destroy engines. Dust storms could blind drivers and choke machinery. The mountain passes between Tehran and the Soviet border climbed to elevations where winter snow made travel impossible for months at a time. Tribal populations, resentful of the occupation, could be expected to attack convoys and sabotage infrastructure. German agents like Dietrich himself were supposed to be organizing exactly such resistance, turning Iran into a second front that would drain Allied resources and disrupt the flow of supplies. Yet the photographs showed none of these expected obstacles having any meaningful effect. The convoys were moving, the supplies were flowing, and German intelligence had been consistently underestimating the scale by a factor of 10. The report Dietrich was writing would not be well received in Berlin, but accuracy mattered more than optimism in intelligence work, at least in theory. He documented that American truck production had reached levels that allowed the United States to ship vehicles to Iran faster than they could be moved north to the Soviet Union. Massive parking lots had been created near the Gulf ports where thousands of brand new trucks sat awaiting assignment, their chrome still gleaming under the Persian sun. The trucks themselves were revelation to anyone who understood mechanized warfare. They were simple, rugged, and designed for mass production rather than engineering elegance. They could be repaired by mechanics with basic tools and maintained under field conditions that would have destroyed more sophisticated German vehicles. More importantly, they were arriving in such numbers that losses to breakdowns, accidents, or sabotage could be absorbed without slowing the overall flow. The Soviets were receiving not just the trucks themselves, but the spare parts, the fuel, and the maintenance knowledge to keep them running. It was American industrial capacity made manifest, rolling north through mountains and deserts toward the front lines where German forces were locked in desperate combat. The human element of the operation added another layer of complexity that Dietrich's superiors in Berlin seemed unable to grasp. The truck drivers making the journey north were a mixture of nationalities and backgrounds: American Army personnel, British colonial subjects from India and elsewhere, Iranian drivers hired by the Allies, and increasingly, Soviet drivers who came south to collect vehicles and drive them home themselves. They moved in organized convoys with military discipline, but they also traveled on roads shared with civilian traffic, with Persian merchants and nomads, with pilgrims heading to Mashhad or Qom, creating a mixture of war and normal life that made intelligence gathering both easier and more ambiguous. Dietrich's network of informants could report convoy movements with relative ease, because the convoys made no particular effort at concealment, but translating those observations into accurate assessments of total volume and strategic impact required analysis that was constantly being revised upward. The railway operation running parallel to the truck convoys presented its own intelligence nightmare. American Army engineers had arrived in Iran with equipment and expertise that transformed the Trans-Iranian Railway from a marginal operation into something approaching an efficient supply line. They had rebuilt bridges, reinforced tunnels, improved track beds, and introduced American locomotives that could pull heavier loads up steeper grades than the original British and German engines the railway had used before the occupation. Trains ran day and night, moving north from the Gulf loaded with crated aircraft, tanks, ammunition, food, raw materials, and every other commodity a modern war machine required. The return journey south brought nothing, a one-way flow of resources that existed solely to keep the Soviet Union fighting. British railway officers coordinated schedules with the precision they had learned managing India's vast rail network, while American officers applied industrial efficiency methods that treated the railway like a factory floor where every delay cost lives on the Eastern Front. Dietrich had spent months trying to organize sabotage operations against this flow, recruiting among Iranian nationalists who resented the occupation, among tribal leaders whose authority had been undermined by Allied military government, among anyone who might be persuaded that disrupting the supply line served their interests. The results had been modest at best and disastrous at worst. The Allies had blanketed the railway and major roads with security that combined British military police, American Army Guards, Soviet NKVD agents, and Iranian personnel whose loyalty had been purchased or coerced. Sabotage attempts were detected and stopped before they could do significant damage, or they succeeded in destroying a bridge or section of track, only to watch Allied engineers rebuild it within days using prefabricated components and construction techniques that treated infrastructure as disposable and replaceable. The few successful attacks that caused meaningful delays had resulted in such aggressive counterintelligence responses that Dietrich's network had been rolled up in sections, with agents arrested, turned, or simply disappearing in ways that suggested summary execution rather than formal imprisonment. The strategic implications of the Persian corridor were what made Dietrich's cigarette burn down unnoticed between his fingers as he wrote. The Allies were moving approximately 5,000 tons of supplies per month through Iran when the operation began in 1942. By mid-1943, that figure had increased to 150,000 tons per month, and American planners were projecting increases to 250,000 tons monthly by year's end. These were not abstract numbers, but represented specific weapons and equipment reaching Soviet forces in quantities that affected battlefield outcomes. The trucks themselves, once they reached Soviet territory, were being distributed to Red Army units, where they transformed logistics and mobility. Soviet infantry divisions that had relied on horse-drawn wagons or railway-bound supply dumps now had motorized transport that allowed them to maintain offensive operations over greater distances. Soviet tank armies could move faster and sustain operations longer when their support echelons rode in American trucks rather than requisitioning transport from a civilian economy that barely functioned under wartime conditions. The aircraft arriving through Iran were equally significant, though less visible than truck convoys. American-built fighters and bombers were being assembled at air bases in southern Iran and flown north to Soviet units, or they arrived as crated components to be assembled at Soviet facilities using American tools and Soviet labor. The numbers mattered because they partially offset the catastrophic losses Soviet aviation had suffered in 1941 and 1942, when the Luftwaffe had achieved air superiority through a combination of superior aircraft, better tactics, and the surprise of the initial invasion. By 1943, Soviet pilots were flying American P-39 Airacobras and British Hurricanes in numbers sufficient to contest German air superiority, while Soviet factories concentrated on producing simpler, more numerous aircraft, using resources that would have otherwise gone to obsolete designs. The diversity of aircraft types created maintenance challenges, but it also provided redundancy and options that the Red Air Force had lacked when it relied entirely on domestic production. The food shipments flowing through Iran represented perhaps the most direct impact on Soviet fighting capacity, though they received less attention than the weapons and vehicles. The Soviet Union was experiencing famine conditions in many regions by 1943, with German occupation forces controlling some of the most productive agricultural areas and the remainder of Soviet agriculture disrupted by mobilization of rural labor for the military and factories. American wheat, sugar, canned meat and other foodstuffs arriving through Iran were keeping Soviet workers productive and Soviet soldiers fed at levels that maintained combat effectiveness. A Red Army soldier receiving regular rations that included American canned pork and condensed milk could march farther and fight harder than one subsisting on thin soup and black bread. Soviet factory workers building tanks and artillery pieces could work longer shifts and maintain quality, and they were adequately fed. The psychological impact of knowing that food would arrive, that starvation was not imminent, allowed both military and civilian populations to focus on the war effort rather than immediate survival. Dietrich understood that his report needed to convey not just numbers, but implications, and the implications were stark. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union had been predicated on the assumption that the Soviets lacked the industrial depth to sustain a prolonged war after the initial campaigns destroyed their forward armies and occupied their western territories. That assumption had proven false, not because Soviet industry alone was sufficient, though it proved more resilient than German planners expected, but because the Soviets had access to American and British resources on a scale that effectively gave them a war economy larger than Germany's. The Persian Corridor was one manifestation of that combined economic power, a logistics pipeline that ran beyond the reach of German military force and therefore could not be interdicted except through intelligence operations and sabotage that had proven largely ineffective. The political dimension added another layer of frustration to the intelligence picture. Iran's occupation by British and Soviet forces in 1941 had been bloodless and rapid, overwhelming the small Iranian army before Germany could organize any meaningful support for Iranian resistance. The Shah's son, installed as the new ruler, maintained nominal independence while Allied military authorities controlled all strategic decisions. The Iranian population was divided in its response to occupation, with some welcoming the Allied presence as preferable to German influence, others resenting foreign control regardless of which power exercised it, and most simply trying to survive while their country became a battlefield of intelligence and counterintelligence operations. German agents like Dietrich operated in an environment where the occupying powers had superior force, better intelligence networks, and the resources to buy or coerce cooperation from local officials. Every successful intelligence operation had to navigate not just Allied security, but also the uncertain loyalty of Iranian contacts who might be playing multiple sides or might simply be reporting everything to the highest bidder. The summer of 1943 was proving to be a turning point that Dietrich could recognize even as he participated in it from the losing side. The German offensive at Kursk had just failed catastrophically in July, marking the last major German strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht was being pushed back across a front that stretched from Leningrad to the Black Sea, with Soviet forces displaying a level of operational competence and material superiority that would have been unthinkable in 1941. The supplies flowing through Iran were part of that transformation, trucks and aircraft and food that freed Soviet industry to focus on producing the tanks and artillery that German forces were encountering in ever greater numbers. The Lend-Lease program, which included not just the Persian corridor but also convoys through Murmansk and Vladivostok, was providing roughly $11 billion worth of aid to the Soviet Union by 1943, with projections for continued expansion through 1944 and beyond. This was economic warfare, on a scale that made traditional military operations look almost quaint in comparison. Dietrich included in his report a section on the administrative achievement represented by the Persian corridor, knowing his military superiors would likely skip past it to focus on tactical details. The Allies had created a multinational logistics operation that required coordination between American, British, Soviet, and Iranian authorities, each with their own procedures, priorities, and communication systems. American army officers worked alongside British colonial administrators, Soviet commissars, and Iranian officials, somehow managing to move supplies efficiently despite language barriers, cultural differences, and the natural friction of bureaucracy. They had established supply depots, maintenance facilities, medical stations, and housing for personnel all along the 900-mile route from the Persian Gulf to the Soviet border. They had created a currency system to pay Iranian workers, a legal framework to handle disputes and crimes, a medical system to treat tropical diseases and injuries, and a communications network that kept Tehran in constant contact with ports in the south and border crossings in the north. It was colonialism and modern management combined, neither entirely comfortable with the other, but functioning well enough to achieve its purpose. The trucks themselves had become symbols of American material superiority to anyone who paid attention to such things. A Studebaker US 6 truck could carry 2.5 tons of cargo across terrain that would have stopped most German vehicles. It had a simple inline-six engine that ran on low-octane gasoline, which meant it could use fuel that Soviet refineries produced, rather than requiring the high-octane aviation fuel that German tanks and vehicles increasingly demanded. Its suspension could handle roads that were little more than tracks across the desert or through mountains. Its cab was unheated and uncomfortable, but it was also uncomplicated and could be operated by drivers with minimal training. Soviet soldiers who drove these trucks north discovered that American engineering philosophy prioritized function over form, durability over elegance, and ease of maintenance over sophisticated performance. These were trucks designed for a country that had automotive factories capable of producing thousands per month and saw vehicles as disposable commodities to be used until they broke and then replaced, rather than lovingly maintained for years. The German response to the Persian corridor had been limited by geography and resources. The Luftwaffe lacked the range to conduct sustained bombing operations against Iranian targets from bases in occupied Soviet territory or the Middle East. The ports on the Persian Gulf were beyond the reach of German naval forces, protected by British naval dominance and the sheer distance from any German naval base. The railway and roads running through Iran could not be reached by German ground forces without a major offensive through the Caucasus that had already failed in 1942. This left intelligence operations and sabotage as the only available tools, and both had proven insufficient against an operation that had redundancy and resilience built into every aspect of its design. Dietrich's report would recommend continued efforts at disruption because that was the only option available, but he harbored no illusions about the likely impact. The Allies were willing to accept losses and delays as part of the cost of doing business, absorbing damage and rebuilding with resources that seemed limitless compared to Germany's increasingly strained economy. The human cost of the Persian corridor operation received little attention in intelligence reports, but Dietrich noticed it in the details his informants provided. American soldiers and engineers died in Iran from heat stroke, disease, vehicle accidents, and the occasional sabotage attack that succeeded. British colonial troops, many of them Indian or African soldiers, worked in conditions that would have violated peacetime labor laws, building roads and guarding convoys under a sun that could kill the unwary. Iranian laborers were paid wages that seemed generous by local standards, but constituted a fraction of what Allied military personnel received, creating resentment that German agents tried to exploit with limited success. Soviet drivers who came south to collect vehicles faced the longest journey, driving thousands of miles from the Soviet border through Iran, then north again through mountains and deserts, often sleeping in their cabs and eating whatever food they could carry or purchase along the way. The women pilots of Soviet aviation regiments flew American aircraft north from Iranian assembly points, navigating over terrain that offered few landmarks and no mercy for navigational errors. The intelligence war surrounding the Persian corridor had its own rhythm and casualties. Dietrich's network of informants included Iranian merchants who reported convoy movements, railway workers who photographed supply shipments, officials whose resentment of occupation made them willing to share information. Each of these sources represented a compromise between the intelligence value of their reports and the risk of their exposure to Allied counterintelligence. The British Security Service and American Counterintelligence Corps operated in Iran with the kind of resources and authority that made agent networks vulnerable to detection and penetration. Soviet NKVD officers, paranoid by training and experience, suspected everyone and arrested people on the basis of evidence that would have been insufficient in Western legal systems, but proved disturbingly accurate in identifying actual German agents. Iranian security forces, answering to the occupying powers but maintaining their own agendas, could be helpful or obstructive, depending on personalities and circumstances that changed faster than German intelligence could track. The summer heat that had greeted Dietrich that morning in Tehran was itself a factor in the intelligence equation. Temperatures in southern Iran regularly exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit, creating conditions that affected not just human comfort, but mechanical reliability and operational tempo. Truck engines overheated, requiring convoys to travel during cooler evening and night hours. Railway tracks expanded in the heat, requiring constant maintenance to prevent derailments. Personnel worked shorter shifts and consumed vast quantities of water, requiring logistical support for the logistical operation. The Allies had adapted to these conditions with the same systematic approach they applied to every other challenge, creating shade structures at stopping points, distributing salt tablets to prevent heat exhaustion, scheduling maintenance during the hottest parts of the day when travel was most dangerous. German intelligence tried to use the heat as an ally, timing sabotage operations for periods when Allied responses would be slower, but the advantage proved marginal at best. The photograph on Dietrich's desk that had prompted his report showed a specific convoy that had been tracked for 3 days as it moved north from Avaz toward Tehran. The convoy consisted of 97 trucks, each carrying supplies that intelligence analysis suggested included aircraft engines, ammunition, and spare parts for tanks. The trucks traveled in groups of 10 to 15 vehicles, maintaining intervals that allowed for mechanical breakdowns without stopping the entire convoy. British military police vehicles provided security at the front and rear of each group, while Iranian police handled civilian traffic control at towns and villages along the route. The convoy had covered over 400 miles in 3 days, moving during evening and early morning hours, resting during the heat of midday, achieving an average speed that would have been impossible for German supply columns trying to move similar distances across Russian terrain. This was routine efficiency rather than exceptional performance, which made it more rather than less impressive from an intelligence perspective. The Allied personnel managing the Persian corridor operation had created a hybrid culture that blended American informality, British imperial procedure, Soviet ideological rigidity, and Iranian attempts at maintaining dignity under occupation. American officers addressed each other by first names and made decisions based on practical outcomes rather than protocol. British officers maintained ranks and procedures that had been developed over centuries of colonial administration, treating the Persian corridor as another logistical challenge comparable to supplying armies in India or Africa. Soviet officers viewed every interaction through the lens of ideological correctness and political reliability, suspecting sabotage and counter-revolutionary activity in every delay or problem. Iranian officials tried to preserve what autonomy they could, while serving masters who made clear that cooperation was expected and resistance would be crushed. Somehow, this mixture functioned well enough to move thousands of tons of supplies northward every day. Dietrich's report concluded with an assessment that bordered on the philosophical, though he disguised it as strategic analysis to avoid accusations of defeatism. The Persian corridor represented a form of warfare that Germany was not equipped to fight, a logistical and industrial competition that favored powers with access to resources, manufacturing capacity, and the ability to project that power across global distances. Germany's military excellence, its tactical innovations, its ideological commitment, none of these advantages could offset the fundamental reality that the Allies could produce and move more supplies than German forces could destroy. The Eastern Front was consuming German strength at rates that could not be sustained indefinitely, while Soviet strength was being replenished through routes like the Persian corridor that operated beyond German reach. The intelligence war in Iran was revealing not just the scale of Allied supply operations, but the futility of trying to disrupt them through clandestine means when the underlying imbalance of resources was so overwhelming. The cigarette had burned down to his fingers by the time Dietrich finished his report. He stubbed it out and read through the document one final time, checking for any statements that might be interpreted as defeatism or political unreliability. The report was factual, professional, and deeply pessimistic about Germany's ability to meaningfully disrupt the flow of supplies through Iran. He signed it, sealed it in the diplomatic pouch that would carry it to Berlin via Istanbul, and sat back in his chair feeling the weight of knowledge that could not change outcomes. The convoys would continue moving north. The trains would keep running. American trucks would carry Soviet soldiers toward Berlin, while German intelligence officers filed reports that documented their own strategic irrelevance. The war would be decided by factories in Detroit and oil fields in Texas as much as by battles in Ukraine or White Russia, and there was nothing that agents in Tehran could do to alter that fundamental reality. Outside his window, the call to prayer echoed across Tehran from a dozen mosques, a reminder that the war was being fought across civilizations and cultures that had their own histories and futures beyond the temporary concerns of German and Allied military planners. Iranian civilians going about their lives under occupation had no particular interest in whether Soviet or German forces prevailed in distant battles, except insofar as it affected their own safety and livelihoods. The trucks rolling north through their country carried supplies that would kill German soldiers, but they also brought employment and money that kept Iranian families fed during wartime disruption. The railway that the Allies had improved might eventually serve Iranian development after the war ended and the occupying forces departed. The roads that American engineers were building would remain after the convoys stopped, infrastructure that would outlast the war's immediate purposes. History would continue past the concerns that dominated Dietrich's daily work, and intelligence reports filed in Berlin would become historical documents to be studied by people who did not yet exist and could not imagine the world that would follow the war's conclusion. Dietrich stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains visible beyond the city's sprawl. Somewhere beyond those peaks, Soviet and German forces were locked in combat that would determine whether the Third Reich survived another year or collapsed under the weight of its overextended ambitions. The supplies moving through Iran were part of that calculation, trucks and aircraft and food that translated American industrial capacity into Soviet fighting power. The intelligence officer's job was to report and analyze, to provide decision-makers with information they could use to adjust strategy and tactics. But what happened when the information revealed that strategy itself was inadequate, that the war was being lost, not through poor decisions, but through fundamental imbalances that could not be corrected through better intelligence or improved operations? These were questions that belonged more to history than to intelligence work, but they pressed on Dietrich's mind as he watched the afternoon shadows lengthen across Tehran, knowing that tomorrow would bring more photographs, more reports, more evidence of convoys that moved through Iran overnight, carrying the instruments of Germany's defeat toward the front lines, where they would be deployed against Wehrmacht soldiers who had no idea that their fate was being decided by logistics operations in a country most of them could not locate on a map. The Persian corridor would operate through the end of the war, eventually delivering over 5 million tons of supplies to the Soviet Union through a route that German intelligence could observe but never effectively disrupt. The trucks that rolled north through Iranian mountains and deserts became as much a part of the Soviet war effort as T-34 tanks or Katyusha rockets, American-made vehicles driven by Soviet soldiers toward battlefields where German forces would recognize the trucks as symbols of their strategic defeat. The intelligence reports filed by officers like Dietrich documented this process with professional precision, creating an archive of Germany's gradual recognition that the war could not be won through military operations alone, that industrial capacity and resource access mattered more than tactical excellence or ideological commitment. These reports would survive the war, captured by Allied intelligence services, and eventually declassified for historians who would use them to understand how wars are won and lost through logistics and economics, as much as through battles and campaigns. If you found this exploration of intelligence work and strategic logistics compelling, Subscribe to discover more untold stories from the Eastern Front, where the true complexity of the Second World War reveals itself in the details that shaped outcomes far from the famous battlefields. The Persian Corridor was more than a supply route. It was a demonstration that modern war is won in factories and ports, as much as in trenches and tank battles, a lesson that remains relevant decades after the convoys stopped rolling north toward a front that ultimately moved west to Berlin. Carried on trucks that had crossed Iran overnight, while German intelligence officers filed reports that documented their own side's strategic irrelevance in the face of Allied material superiority.